The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon to our folks on the East Coast, and good morning to our advisory support on the West Coast. Thank you so much for joining us in the Delta Upsilon Alumni Advisor webinar series. Today, we are going to do a general review of loss prevention policies, specifically addressing some of the major changes brought to the policies in July of 2018 by our board of directors. I am Sarah Jahantzuz-Ray, and I have the privilege of serving the International Fraternity as Director of Loss Prevention. I do a lot of educational work with our undergraduate men regarding safety and ensuring that good choices and decisions and behavior are a part of our fraternity experience for these young men. When we were coming up with the topic for this month's webinar, we thought it would be great to just do a general review of policy and procedure connected to loss prevention, so that our advisory support is on the same page as the educational programming for our undergrads. So without further ado, we will go ahead and dive into our loss prevention policies. So I thought it would be good to discuss a little bit about the board of director leadership in the creation and the enforcement of our LP policies. As you can see, we have two committees that work hand in hand with determining the policy and enforcement of the policy. So our loss prevention committee, which is comprised of members of the board of directors as well as alumni that are very knowledgeable in the areas of loss prevention through career work and volunteer work, create and make recommendations to the board of directors regarding the policies and procedures. When we have an allegation of a loss prevention violation, our judicial committee works hand in hand with our undergraduate chapters as well as IHQ staff in order to enforce and provide recommendations for further action when it comes to holding undergraduate chapters accountable. I think one of the most common misconceptions is that our enforcement or outcomes and sanctioning comes directly from international headquarters staff. That's not actually correct. All decisions and outcomes related to chapter and individual behavior goes through the judicial committee, which is comprised of current board members, both alumni and undergraduate. Also, in order to get a chapter prepared for a judicial hearing, I do a pre-hearing call so that we can practice and review common questions that will be asked of the undergraduate membership, as well as just helping students to be more comfortable and less nervous about working with our judicial committee. I would say the majority of the time, any sort of outcome or sanctioning is typically tied to educational programming and initiatives. However, sometimes in very severe situations, there are punitive outcomes that are connected with our judicial committee. Also, again, as I mentioned previously, our loss prevention policies were most recently reviewed and updated in July 2018. And we have changed all of our educational programming to ensure that those changes are discussed and provided to our undergraduate and advisory support members. So we have a number of categories of policy within our loss prevention policies and resources. So the way in which everything is categorized is under the areas of alcohol and drugs, hazing, discrimination, harassment, and sexual misconduct, the medical good Samaritan policy, physical abuse, fire, health, and safety, education, and reporting. We are able to provide this directly on the deltau.org website and multiple locations across the website so that our membership and our volunteers always have access to all of our loss prevention expectations. So we're going to go ahead and just dive in component to component regarding our alcohol and drug policy. I will say the biggest area in the loss prevention policies that is typically adjudicated by our judicial committee is oftentimes related to alcohol. We're very fortunate. We have very few issues with drugs and substance outside of alcohol within our chapter facilities as well as within our membership. But most of the issues that we oh, excuse me, I apologize for that. Most of the issues that we are focused on are related to alcohol currently. So first and foremost in the policy, we outlined that there is no tolerance for possession, sale, or distribution of illegal or controlled substances. Now, this is a conversation that is definitely ongoing as we see culture change around marijuana. So we are definitely engaged in some very provocative conversations with our board of directors regarding legalization of marijuana. As of today, in our US chapters, we defer to federal law, and so marijuana is not permitted within chapter facilities or at chapter events. And then also in our Canadian chapters, as of today, we also do not condone the use of marijuana, but that conversation continues to happen among the board. Also, just a couple of trends to share with you about controlled substances. We are certainly seeing a rise in prescription drug abuse. I've done some research specifically in the area of stimulants. So when you're looking at some of those medications connected to ADD and ADHD, Ritalin, Vyvanse, Adderall, those sorts of categories, as you research the prescriptions being utilized with our college students, what we're finding is that on a college campus, when an individual has a prescription for that medication, 75% of the prescription medication is not being taken by the individual. It's being distributed or sold to other people on college campuses. As we have conversations with our undergrads, 9 times out of 10, they can identify or tell us exactly where they could go on campus to purchase this sort of medication assistance from their fellow peer students. So that's an incredibly concerning statistic, as well as concerning behavior and decision. The other areas where we're seeing some issue is the use and abuse of anti-anxiety medication. Very, very specifically, the abuse of Xanax is something that is definitely on the rise. But we're also seeing other anti-anxiety medication being distributed or sold, as well as some sleep aids that are controlled substances. So always want to engage in some really meaningful dialogue with our young men, that just because you have been prescribed a medication that is right for you according to your prescribing physician does not mean that your brother, girlfriend, friend, whoever else should have that medication as well. So that's something that we've been very, very heavily discussing with a number of our young men when we're doing loss prevention training. As we move on, the majority of the rest of the policy really outlines alcohol for the most part. So we want to ensure that if our chapters are hosting any sort of events, that they're always following state and federal law. So we're not distributing any sort of alcohol to underage individuals. Also, we really, really focus on how the alcohol is distributed. So we support BYOB as well as third-party vendors. We will always defer that third-party vendors are the most safe and the most liable group to handle any sort of alcohol sales or distribution. So that's always the best bet, is if the chapter can afford it, to hire a third-party vendor to handle any sort of alcohol that's going to be distributed to folks that are 21 or up. With BYOB, we have a great BYOB guideline that's been brought to us by the North American Interfraternity Conference. That BYOB guideline packet is located all over our website, specifically under chapter resources. It's also a tool that we distribute at our educational programming hosted by the fraternity. So folks that attend the Regional Leadership Academy, the Leadership Institute, and President's Academy all receive hard copies of the BYOB guidelines. So That's something that we always try to encourage our groups, if they can afford it, to utilize the third-party vendor. But if not, then we get them very well equipped to utilize BYOB policies and guidelines. So the number 3 piece of the LP policy is that no chapter funds or passing of the hat can be related to the purchase of any sort of alcohol. What we're seeing is that rather than passing the hat with cash, a lot of students are utilizing PayPal and Venmo in order to collect funds to buy mass quantities of alcohol. That's another piece of our policy that we don't tolerate. As far as alcohol that's brought into a facility with BYOB, it needs to be marked in 12-ounce containers. And we do not support the use of kegs. Most commonly, you'll hear undergraduates talk about punches, specifically trash can punch, where mass quantities of hard alcohol and mixers are mixed together and distributed as anyone who wants to engage in drinking that. So not only do we not support utilizing chapter monies or passing of the hat, we also do not support the distribution of mass quantities of any sort of alcohol. Also, for number 4, so open parties are not allowed when alcohol is present. So sometimes our students get a little confused about this, and they think that maybe holding an alcohol-free philanthropy needs to have a guest list. It does not. If there are events such as intramurals, philanthropies, community service events, as long as those events have no alcohol connected to the activities, there's no need for a guest list. However, if there is going to be an event where alcohol is present, either by third-party vendor or BYOB, open parties are not allowed. A guest list should always be utilized. It's also very good to note that submitting rosters from all of the sororities on campus do not equate to a guest list. So when it comes to procedures, the way in which we handle a guest list for a typical social event is that each brother can invite up to 3 guests. Now, we always have to keep in mind that some of our universities have alternate expectations. We do work with some campus partners that require a 1-to-1 guest ratio or a 1-to-2 guest ratio. We always want to defer to the stricter of the policy. But as far as procedures for Delta Upsilon, a 3-to-1 ratio is permitted. The only time where that changes is if the individual chapter is hosting an event that is overnight or away from campus or away from the community in which the chapter is located. So we have a number of chapters that do semi-formals as well as formals that are out of town. They're typically utilizing group transportation with buses and whatnot. But in those situations where you're going away and you're not utilizing a chapter facility, the guest to brother ratio changes to 1-to-1. So that's something that we always, as we're reviewing plans for formals or semi-formals that will be out of town, we always make sure that that guest list doesn't exceed 1 guest per brother. Also, by allowing each brother to put 3 individuals on the guest list for an event, we can hold a brother accountable for inviting individuals that create any sort of disruptive nature to the event in itself. And so that creates a better sense of accountability rather than just throwing 100 names onto a list. The one other thing to always consider as well is the fire capacity of the event location. So sometimes we have to adjust the guest list based on fire capacity as well. So just something to keep in mind. Also, I did fail to mention this. One other really best practice that I highly, highly encourage young men to do is that if they are going out of town or going overnight for a social event, it's a really great idea to leave a copy of the guest list with emergency contact information with an advisor, as well as a university official. So if there is something that occurs that's concerning, we've got folks on the ground back in the campus community as well as on staff with the university to help work through any issues that may arise. I mentioned this earlier, but the number 5 component of the alcohol and drug policy is that no minors may be served or consume alcohol at any time. One of the trickiest things that we are encountering on a very regular basis is pre-gaming. So many underage students are choosing to pre-game, sometimes with drugs as well, prior to coming to the event. So oftentimes we see medical transports occur with individuals who have never been served at the Delta Upsilon event, but they've arrived incredibly intoxicated. One of the things I encourage our membership to always do is at the door, as IDs are being checked, if individuals try to bring in bottled water or a large Yeti cup or something with liquid in it, ask them to dump it and to always have alternative beverages readily available within the facility where the event is. That really cuts down on underage students bringing in water bottles of clear alcohol, or bringing in, mixed drinks in their water bottles, that sort of thing. So, big recommendation there is that no one brings in non-alcoholic beverages, because we'll have alternative food and beverage readily available at the event. Okay, so when our chapters are fundraising for local philanthropy and or for our global service initiative with the International Fraternity, we want to ensure that none of our chapters co-sponsor events with taverns and bars. So by collecting a cover charge at a tavern or bar and utilizing that as a donation to a philanthropic cause is not acceptable when it comes to our policy and procedure. With a tavern or bar having open access, there's no way to have a guest list unless we have specifically rented that event space for a social event connected to the fraternity. So there's just far too much liability connected with co-sponsorship of taverns and bars. Also, our chapters oftentimes want to co-sponsor social events with other chapters in their campus community. A couple of procedures connected to that is that we tend to always ask our chapters not to co-sponsor with more than 2 additional organizations. So a total of 3 organizations co-sponsoring is the maximum. Oftentimes at some of our very large Division I schools, chapters want to have 4-way or 5-way parties, and it's just far too many people to manage and puts a ton of stress on the facility as well, because typically no one has the fire capacity to have that many people in one location. The biggest thing in this area is that our chapters need to be very, very transparent with the groups in which they're co-sponsoring with, because it is expected that all organizations abide by DU loss prevention procedures and policies. So if the chapter is looking to co-sponsor with a group that has different policies and procedures that conflict with the fraternities, that is very, very problematic. And we want to ensure that everyone who is coming to a DU co-sponsored event is going to respect and adhere to the policies and procedures of our international fraternity. Also, all recruitment-related events must be alcohol-free at all times. This is also an expectation of the North American Interfraternity Conference and all of our campus partners at this time. We are currently not partnered with any campus that supports recruitment-related events with alcohol present. So in order to be a good partner to our campus IFCs, as well as our universities and colleges where we're located, we ensure that our recruitment-related events are always alcohol-free. This also makes a lot of sense too, because the majority of men who are being recruited to our colonies and our chapters are oftentimes under the age of 21. We do not condone or support the engagement in any sort of drinking game. Research tells us that engaging and participating in drinking games creates a culture of very, very quick consumption of alcoholic beverages. And because of that research and the culture of rapid consumption, we do not support members and or associate members engaging in any sort of drinking game at any of our events, our facilities, or anything that could be considered connected to the fraternity. Also, no alcohol should be present with any of our associate member activities. As you all know, our associate member education program is outfitted for all of our colonies and chapters to utilize in a way in which every associate member should be having a similar experience, regardless of chapter, colony, or campus in which they're joining. As you know, the program is an 8-week program that's quite intensive when it comes to developing leadership skills, character, brotherhood, all of those great aspirational skills that we want to ensure our chapter members have. And as we look at that 8-week period, there's just no time whatsoever for any sort of substance to be a part of that program. So we do not permit any sort of alcohol-related activity when it comes to working with our associate members. Most specifically, Big Brother or Dad reveal nights, as well as initiation, should all be alcohol-free at all times. And then the newest component to the alcohol and drug policy that went into effect in July of 2018 is that the possession, use, or consumption of alcohol products above 15% ABV is prohibited in all of our chapter facilities. So in the past, when third-party vendors came into our chapter facilities to manage the distribution of alcohol, there were times in which they would distribute hard alcohol drinks or cocktails. That's no longer permitted. Also, we just want to ensure that when there's consumption of these beverages, that hard alcohol is not a part of the equation. We also encourage, when a party's occurring, in order for BYOB to work the best that it can, is that all individuals who are at the event stay in common spaces. We want to ensure that the bedrooms and private living quarters of our members are not accessed during the time of these events. That is when we most commonly see allegations of rapid consumption of hard alcohol and sometimes allegations of sexual misconduct when those private living quarters are accessed by our undergraduate members and their guests during social events with alcohol. Moving into our hazing policy, I think one of the best parts about Delta Upsilon membership is the zero tolerance for hazing. As I mentioned earlier, the associate member education program is built in a way to ensure that we take good men and we make them better before they're initiated. So we do not condone or support chapters, colonies, members, alumni, or employees of the fraternity to engage in any sort of mistreatment of associate members and or new initiates. We honestly do not adjudicate or hear many cases connected to hazing in the fraternity, which is fantastic. I don't think a lot of our peers in the industry can say the same thing. But I would say the most common things that we are trying to mitigate at this time is forms of servitude by associate members to active members. That is oftentimes connected to signature books. So when I hear a chapter talk about interviewing older members and utilizing signature books, I have a lot of conversations with them about ensuring that that's not connected to any forms of servitude in order to get signatures of older active members. Also, we want to make sure that folks are safe. We want to make sure that we don't see associate members or new initiates doing all of the house cleaning of our facilities. We want to ensure they're not doing 24-hour a day designated driving. Just some of those lower level issues are things that we revisit and visit on a regular basis to ensure that our chapters across North America are not picking up behavior that other organizations are engaged in their campus communities. So our discrimination, harassment, and sexual misconduct pieces, a little bit of this piece of the policy went into play in July 2018. So I'll start with sexual misconduct. That's been a part of our policy for a number of years. Specifically in my role in serving as director of loss prevention, and then in my previous role of serving as a dean of students at two different state universities, I handle a lot of the Title IX investigations and working with Title IX coordinators on college campuses. So we have no tolerance for sexual misconduct. However, we work with the university to determine if there's any sort of burden of proof or any sort of outcome from a university investigation connected to sexual misconduct. When we have a brother who has been alleged to have engaged in sexual misconduct, we oftentimes ask that brother to consider a temporary suspension so that he can focus on the university investigation as well as any criminal investigations or charges that he may be faced. When we have those conversations, we just talk about priorities and knowing that there could be a criminal charge or a change in status regarding student status at a university, it becomes quite clear that membership in the fraternity is not the number one priority. So it makes most sense for the young man to step away for a short period of time until any sort of resolutions occurred. What you'll see with a Title IX office on a college campus is that oftentimes interim measures are taken when there's been an allegation. So if a respondent and an alleged victim are in the same classrooms, one of those individuals will be moved or be taking the course in an alternate format, oftentimes online. Also, if the two individuals or anybody connected to the misconduct lives in the same residence hall or on the same floor, individuals are moved in order to ensure that there's a fair investigation and a fair adjudication of the issue. Jumping up into the PowerPoint, in July 2018, the Board of Directors ratified the piece of the loss prevention policy to include that our membership not engage in any sort of culturally insensitive behavior, and that we ensure that theme parties are not offensive to any specific group of peoples. So that those are ongoing conversations that we're having with our undergrads at this time. Also, we updated our policy to mirror the policies of our campus partners as well as interfraternity councils across North America, that we do not support or condone the employment of strippers, exotic dancers, or amateur dancers. Oftentimes, you will see in chapter culture, not specifically Delta Upsilon, but chapter culture across North America, that there can be celebratory events in which employment of dancers is part of the celebration. And so we want to make it very, very clear to our membership that that's not tolerated and will be taken very, very seriously if it should occur. Another component of our loss prevention policies that went into play in July 2018 is our medical good Samaritan policy. This mirrors that of our campus partners. This policy protects individuals and it also protects chapters. So if a guest or a brother is in a situation in which medical treatment is necessary, even if it's connected to substance use and abuse, the medical good Samaritan policy protects the individual and protects the chapter. Now, this should not be a situation in which a chapter continues to utilize the Good Samaritan policy on a regular basis. That would tell us that there is a chapter culture that's dangerous and concerning, and that we need to take a stronger stance and investigation to figure out why this is happening on a regular basis. But in individual situations, both for individual members and for chapters at large, our biggest concern is keeping individuals safe, whether they're members or guests. And we don't want our membership to be fearful that there's going to be some sort of adjudication connected to keeping individuals safe. It's also very, very necessary that when these sorts of situations pop up where medical treatment is necessary, that the chapter notify IHQ immediately. So that can be done through an incident report that's found on deltau.org's website, or it can be most easily done by calling my cell phone at any point in time, which is 423-227-9989. So our physical abuse policy is both regarding physical abuse among people as well as vandalism on our property or facilities. So we have no tolerance for any sort of physical violence, whether that's with a non-member, a member, associate member, or with our alumni. We do take action against individuals who engage in any sort of physical violence or abuse, and do the best that we can to hold them accountable. Also, we want our property and our facilities to be treated with the utmost respect. And so any sort of vandalism, punching holes into walls, mistreating the property is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. Moving on to fire, health, and safety. We want to ensure that all of our facilities are following fire and health codes. Each of our chapter facilities is inspected by our partners at Holmes Murphy every 3 years. This also provides a loss prevention allocation credit of 10%, as long as our chapters are abiding by that. So it's a great cost savings mechanism, but most importantly, it's a great mechanism for keeping folks safe within our facilities. We also want to ensure that we have postings of emergency procedures throughout every facility connected to the fraternal organization. So emergency contact information as well as fire escape routes need to be posted throughout the facility. Any sort of engineering recommendations, either by our inspection team or by your campus partners, should always be followed, and that those recommendations should be treated with a great sense of urgency as well. We do not allow for the possession of any weapons on the grounds of the facility. This includes vehicles. So in some of our chapters where hunting is a big part of the culture, those gun racks and personal vehicles with weapons in them is not permitted in any way, and no weapons are permitted inside the facility either. And then we updated this piece that candles may only be used in ritual ceremonies of the fraternity. They shouldn't be used in private living quarters, and they shouldn't be used throughout common spaces. Only ritual ceremonies of the fraternity should allow for any sort of candle to be present. So wanted to go over our educational requirements for each group. Annually, every chapter is expected to review all loss prevention policies, and every member should sign an agreement that they will follow those policies. So that's a basic expectation of CEP operations, is that every chapter will review policies and procedures each academic year. We also provide extensive training in loss prevention policies, procedures at our regional leadership academies, our annual Leadership Institute, at all of our Building Better Men retreats. And then I do a great deal of virtual sessions with our colonies and chapters. So if any colony or chapter wants to have an IHQ staff member conduct a session, if I'm not able to do it in person, I do it most commonly over Skype and Zoom video conferencing for any of our groups seeking that assistance. As I mentioned before, reporting is very important. If there's any sort of incident, whether that is property damage, an individual experiencing an accident or a medical transport, any sort of issue connected to LP policies and procedures should result in an online incident report form submitted by chapter leadership or chapter advisors. And then again, I've listed here my cell phone number, where chapter members often text me to give me a heads up that the incident report is coming or that they need to speak with me. Also take calls on a regular basis over nights, evenings, weekends regarding that. Never be scared to call. It's totally fine. If I'm sleeping, I may miss it, but it lets me know that it's urgent and that I need to get in touch with you as soon as possible. And now we are at Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in at this time. Okay, well, thank you folks so much for the work that you do for Delta Upsilon and the support that you provide our young membership. If you have any follow-up, feel free to reach out at any point in time. Also, if you would like to make this webinar accessible to the undergraduate membership, it will be posted on our website by the close of business this week. So thank you so much for all that you do to support young men becoming better men, and have a beautiful holiday season.